Cool. Let's get started. Like I said, it's just like an open conversation. But what I would love for you to do is do a brief intro about like who you are and what project you run, and do a little bit of an intro on like where you came from and how you actually got in Web3, and then we'll just kick it off from there.
Hey, I'm MacLane Wilkison. I am one of the founders of Threshold Network. Threshold Network is the home of tBTC, which is a decentralized, permissionless Bitcoin bridge and liquidity layer that brings Bitcoin to DeFi.
That's cool. That's cool. How do you get into crypto?
Yeah, so I got into crypto back in 2013. I was working out of a place called Hacker Dojo, which was like a makerspace in Silicon Valley, a little bit south of San Francisco,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of randomly popped into this SF Bitcoin Devs user group out of curiosity. I've heard about Bitcoin, but hadn't really taken a deep look at the time. But that meetup happened to be like I think it was 6 people. It was me, a guy named Michael Egarov, who ended up co-founding the precursor to Threshold with me called NuCypher. He's now running the Curve decentralized exchange. Zucky, who was one of the early Cosmos contributors, and then one of the founders of Definity, which I think is now called ICP. And so like this really cool group of early crypto people that were doing a lot of interesting things, and was very fortunate just to kind of fall in with those folks very early on, um, and sort of just fell down the rabbit hole from there.
Yeah. Is tBTC or Threshold Network the first crypto project you started? Have you started anything before?
So TBT or Threshold is technically it is the sort of rebrand or merged entity of the project that I initially started with Michael called NuCypher.
Mm-hmm.
NuCypher was also a threshold cryptography network that was doing like access control and data privacy using fancy basically cryptographic primitives called proxy re-encryption. And that project a couple years ago, I guess, well, it's multiple years ago now, it's in 2021, it merged with another threshold cryptography network called Keep Network, which was
Mm-hmm.
doing similar things, and those two projects formed Threshold. So technically, I was the original founder of NuCypher, which later became Threshold.
Yeah. What is then I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about like tBTC and what it does and what it's for and who's using it? And then maybe also the relation between like the T token and tBTC if there's any.
Yeah, absolutely. So tBTC is a couple things. One, it is a decentralized and permissionless bridge from Bitcoin to Ethereum and other DeFi ecosystems, including a lot of the EVM L2, Solana, and many others very soon. It is also a Bitcoin asset, an IOU asset that lives in the DeFi ecosystem. So if you have, native Bitcoin, you can't really do anything with it on the native Bitcoin blockchain other than just hodl it and hope it goes up, which has been a good move so far. But a lot of people want to do additional things with their Bitcoin. They want to either earn additional yield on top, or they want to pull cash out without having to sell it. So, for example, like borrowing against
Hmm.
that Bitcoin, using it as collateral. So there's like a big incentive to be able to deploy your Bitcoin in DeFi ecosystems on Ethereum and elsewhere to be able to either like yield farm or LP on decentralized exchanges to earn some yield or to lend it out or to borrow against it. Uh, and tBTC gives you a way to do that. What's special about tBTC is that historically, the other ways that people have done that have required basically essentially giving their Bitcoin to some centralized middleman or custodian who you trust to hold on to that Bitcoin for you, and then they give you an IOU on the destination chain representing your Bitcoin. What's different about tBTC and Threshold is we basically disintermediate that middleman and replace it with a decentralized network of signers. So you're not having to trust any single entity to hold on to your Bitcoin for you. You're basically just sharding that Bitcoin in a wallet that's custodied across all the different signers in the Threshold network. And so we're trying to basically minimize the amount of trust that you need to assign any one entity while still being able to use your Bitcoin in DeFi.
Got it. How does that relate to RepBTC, which is used in the
Yeah.
Ethereum
So
network primarily?
essentially, like the identical motivation from a user's perspective. You have Bitcoin, you want to use it. With WBTC, you give your Bitcoin to a company called BitGo, and they handle all the custody, everything to do with it. It's also relatively difficult for retail, or very difficult, if not impossible, for retail users to mint and redeem with
Hmm.
Wrapped Bitcoin. Essentially, it's like limited to special roles they call merchants, who are basically it's accessible to institutions who want to mint and redeem in size. and it's a permission process. tBTC, same use case. You want to deploy your Bitcoin, except it's permissionless. You don't have to onboard with some sort of you know merchant that can do the mint and redeem for you. You can do that permissionlessly, and you don't have to trust any single entity as part of that process.
Yeah. When it comes to BitGo, do they have any? Is it fully known that everything is 100% backed with real Bitcoin? Are they transparent about it, or is that
Yeah,
because for
they
you
do have
guys it doesn't have to be, right? Or you can probably check it on chain if that's the case.
correct. Yeah. So BitGo, I mean, I think they're a great company. They've been around a long time. They do have proof of reserves on their dashboard that you can go and you can see, in theory, like the addresses that are custodying all of the WBTC that's been minted on various chains. Um, what caused a pretty big controversy, I guess, well, I think it was like 6 or 9 months ago, is that they suddenly changed the custody model for WBTC. So
Mm-hmm.
historically, BitGo was was the custodian for all of the Bitcoin, and then they announced for some reason that they were going to involve an entity run by Justin Sun as part of this, basically to share custody of the Bitcoin. And I think for probably obvious reasons for a lot of your viewers, that basically was not acceptable to a lot of WBTC users and to a lot of the DeFi ecosystem. So there's been a pretty significant backlash um, against this sort of new custody model that they've created that I think has been the catalyst for a lot of new Bitcoin, wrapped Bitcoins like CBBTC and many others sort of spinning up to try to fill that sudden gap in the space.
Yeah, I could also imagine that someone can just sell their Bitcoin, their actual physical Bitcoin, get the dollars and buy rep Bitcoin or tBTC. Like, why would someone not just do that rather than actually mint the
Yep.
tBTC? I can imagine Slippage is one of them, but maybe you can explain a bit more.
Yeah, yeah. So it certainly depends on like what kind of size you're talking about. I mean, like the on-chain liquidity for both tBTC and WBTC is quite deep. So you could actually do pretty good size with minimal slippage on the secondary markets on-chain, particularly if you're talking about like ETH1. Obviously, like if you're wanting to mint like 1,000 Bitcoin at a time or something, then you're going to face pretty significant slippage. So you can mint that in one shot on tBTC, and you get for every one Bitcoin that you deposit, you get one tBTC out on the other side. So that's part of it. Um, and then the other use case would be like, let's say your cost basis for your Bitcoin is very low, and this will depend very heavily on your particular tax jurisdiction. Is not going to be relevant in
Mm,
some, will be relevant in others, but in some jurisdictions you would be able to bridge that Bitcoin via tBTC, take out a loan against it, for example, if you wanted to get cash
mm.
out without incurring a taxable event. Whereas obviously, if you're selling your Bitcoin for fiat first and then going and buying WBTC or tBTC on a secondary market, you would have that tax event.
I see. Does that mean that most of the transactions and minting actions happen in bigger sizes rather than smaller sizes as well? Because it makes sense for them, while for smaller fish, it makes sense to just sell the asset and buy rep BTC or tBTC.
Yeah, so I think this is actually like an interesting comparative difference between tBTC and the permissioned versions like WBTC and others, is that, well, first of all, like since the Justin Sun announcement, there has been effectively zero minting on WBTC, so that's basically entirely stopped. But if you look historically, before that at least, uh, because it was institutions who were basically the only ones who were able to mint, it generally was mint and redeems were generally done in quite large size. With tBTC is actually a mix. So we've had 1,000 BTC slug mints at one time. We have a bunch of 100, 200, etc. Like quite large mints, but we also have a lot of smaller mint and redeems. So retail users who have less than a Bitcoin. I think that our minimum mint size is zero point zero 0.01 BTC. So we've had a lot of zero point zero 0.01 BTCs, and anywhere, everywhere up to a one, and we see all over the map. Basically, the distribution for tBTC in terms of mint size is much wider, and I attribute that to its permissionless nature, where it's useful for institutions, it's useful for small businesses, it's useful for your degen, your average degen, all like the whole spectrum of users can use tBTC in a way that is not the case for a lot of the other alternatives.
Got it. How does the T token relate to all of this, and what is the function of it?
Yeah, so the T token is essentially the value accrual mechanism for the bridge. So the bridge monetizes by charging mint and redeem fees. So right now, actually, minting is set to 0%, so it's free to mint at the moment. Redeems are 20 basis points, so you pay the protocol 0.2% when you want to redeem back to native Bitcoin. And T token, what the protocol does with the profits from the bridge is after it covers operations and expenses, it can use some of that profit to repurchase T on the open market. So that
Mm-hmm.
basically the protocol is essentially like a machine that generates Bitcoin as revenue and uses that Bitcoin to repurchase T token. So basically, T holders are able to basically get exposure to the long-term success of the bridge. Uh,
Oh, got it. You
we're,
guys are on. Yeah,
we're
go ahead.
working on some interesting new um, some interesting new features for T tokens. Like we're exploring this potential model, so a little bit of alpha, but like a potential like rebate model where if you stake T token, you can potentially get rebates on the mint and redeem fees. So we're looking at some interesting things that we can do there, but for the moment, it's just basically participating in the fee revenue of the bridge.
Got it. Well, you guys are on Binance right now, right? Like with a T token, so that's been quite a journey, I guess. Like, were you guys on Binance straight at launch, or has that been a real big process before you actually get there?
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, I believe T was, well, so first off, like it's a little bit complicated because of the way the T token originated. We didn't launch T token from scratch. T was basically the combination of these two existing networks, so NuCypher and Keep, both of which were live protocols, live networks with live tokens. So if you had either the new NU token or the Keep token, you could upgrade that token to T. And both of those tokens were listed on a lot of exchanges. I think they both launched around like 2020 or earlier. I can speak to the new token specifically, but new was on Binance. It was on the first exchange it got listed on actually after the network went live and the token was created was on Coinbase.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that was basically the catalyst for essentially all the other tier one exchanges to follow and list new after it was listed by Coinbase because I guess Coinbase does their diligence on or at
Mm-hmm.
least like at the time period there was a pretty significant
Yeah,
data
yeah, yeah. Right now,
yeah,
that's definitely different.
change
Yeah,
across different cycles. Um, but I think a lot of exchanges sort of relied on that initial review by Coinbase, and then obviously it had the credibility to get listed quickly on many other exchanges, including Binance. But we weren't really involved in that process other than answering some diligence questions. I think the
yeah.
process probably today is very different, so I don't know how.
Yeah, most projects they start with like a fundraise, right? Like in a launch pad, and then they go on exchange, and it's a very long journey before they actually go on like some tier two, some tier one exchanges. But you
Yeah.
guys basically skip that first part because you guys are a combination of two tokens that are already listed on exchanges. That's how I see
Yeah,
it.
yeah. So what happened specifically with T is Threshold Network launched. We had basically a vending machine smart contract where you could upgrade your legacy tokens,
Mm-hmm.
and then a lot of the exchanges obviously just basically participated directly on their users' behalf and did that upgrade, or they gave. I think Binance actually did the upgrade with the tokens that they held in custody. I believe Coinbase maybe people had to like withdraw and do it themselves and then redeposit. It's been a while, so I don't remember the exact details, but different exchanges took different approaches. But basically, yeah, T was kind of grandfathered in by virtue of new and to some extent Keep already being on a lot of these exchanges.
Yeah, got it. When you look at, I think tBTC to a certain extent, like liquidity on tBTC on like DEXs is not particularly essential. I think it's more because people can just mint it and use it as long as it can be borrowed against, etc. But
Yeah.
what is the purpose you guys actually need liquidity and DEX pools on tBTC, and what is it mostly used for by people? And then the second question is, how have you grown the TVL, or like the amount of liquidity in the pool, so people can actually start trading decentable sizes? How have you guys organized that?
Yeah, so I think to some extent you're right. Like there is actually like the true like there's I guess like quite a bit of hidden liquidity with tBTC because people can permissionlessly mint. So if like the price gets too depegged from the underlying Bitcoin price, obviously there's a very clear economic incentive for people to arbitrage that and to either mint tBTC and sell it if the price is too high, or the reverse, redeem back to Bitcoin and sell the actual Bitcoin if the price is too low. That said, like on-chain liquidity is definitely very important because a lot of the, let's say like, lending protocols, for example, anyone who needs to do liquidations, in most cases, does not have like the ability to do redemption.
Mm, of course,
So if
yeah.
you're a fully automated lending protocol, like someone like Aave or similar, who needs to be able to liquidate on chain, it's very important that there's sufficient depth on chain, even just setting aside like theoretical hidden liquidity that could come in. So that's like very key. And for tBTC, I mean, I think Aave and Aave is probably like the largest holder on chain of tBTC on Ethel 1, and like lending protocols as a whole are like the primary use case for tBTC. So it's very important that we have very deep liquidities to support that use case. Um,
One of the, I mean, so you guys are on a lot of networks, right? And in general, the liquidity is quite equal across all. What has been you guys' growth strategy? Because I mean, you can grow with multiple chains, but you also got to make sure there's enough liquidity. How we see it for token projects, they go on 20 exchanges, but
yep.
there's no exchange for you guys a chain that really has a lot of good liquidity. So I always am a fan of quality over quantity when it comes to listings, but you can argue the same for you guys as a chain, right? How have you guys approached that?
Yeah, so we've actually rebooted how we're thinking about cross-chain expansion entirely. I'm much more optimistic going forward, like how that will look for our new chain launches, which we'll be scaling up quite a bit the next few months. But generally, the way that we think about it is it's very important to have a very strong start out of the gate. Like we've had like launches where we've launched like tBTC, but like there wasn't a ton of ecosystem support, and like we didn't have sufficient depth for tBTC to get listed on lending protocols, and so you didn't just basically we weren't able to like, if you can nail the launch, you sort of build this sort of just sustainable flywheel right out of the gate. You have sufficient depth, you get it listed on the more sticky TVL protocols like lending protocols or CDPs,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to just it just becomes a little bit more of a self-sustaining thing. Whereas if you fail to get onto the lending protocols or somewhere where there's sticky TVL or basically a sticky protocol, then basically you're just going to have to try to pay like this unsustainable token incentives for this mercenary liquidity like indefinitely, which just doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
The way we think about new chain launches going forward is strong co-marketing support from either the foundation or whatever the relevant entity behind the chain is, as well as the various ecosystem partners. So like the DEXs that we're targeting, the lending protocols that we're targeting, to the extent that like perps platforms, etc. Co-marketing and co-incentives, ideally from all of those, the parent
Yeah.
chain, the foundation, and the existing ecosystem partners, so that we can really quickly get that baseline amount of liquidity, get
Yeah.
it useful on lending protocols, CDPs, perps exchanges, and then you have this more sustainable ecosystem
Yeah.
ready to go from that baseline.
Yeah. You say baseline liquidity. What is that baseline liquidity for you guys in terms of total amount in the pool, or let's say the 2% depth that you guys have on the market for what does that look like? Because if I
Yeah,
look at you guys' current listings, right, there's some chains like Ethereum is like within 2%, if you would calculate it on like a pool level, around like 250,000, which is a decent size. But other chains go down to like maybe like 15, 20, or 30K, so to say. They're significantly more illiquid. Like, what is
yep.
you guys' baseline before you say like, hey, this is really the minimum that people need?
Yeah. So it's gonna vary on a couple things. Like one is like different chains might have different user profiles, right? Like you might not necessarily need quite as much depth of liquidity on, let's say, like an EVML2 that targets like retail users who are like going to be doing like smaller size than you need on like Ethel 1, where you need to cater to large whales and institutions who are deploying significant amount of capital. And then the other the other thing that it can vary on is like uh, what kind of dexes are there. So like if you need to build a lot of deep liquidity on an AMM, you need just a higher like TVL baseline than if you have like some sort of like order book type protocol on some of the
Mm-hmm.
faster chains some of the faster chains. So it's hard to say like there's like specific amounts. It varies a lot by chain.
Yeah, are you guys the main liquidity provider, or is it? Do you guys have other parties, or how much is basically organic by potentially users that want to collect fees on the trading?
So we have like a network of LP providers. Threshold doesn't provide like liquidity itself as a protocol or a DAO. But we have like a network of LP providers that will surface basically like, hey, we're launching on XYZ chain. These are going to be like the list of opportunities, and then obviously we surface that simultaneously with just the broader community
Mm-hmm.
come in, and then also ideally, when we're taking tBTC to a new ecosystem, that's an ecosystem of new users who maybe aren't users on tBTC on other chains who also want exposure to Bitcoin. And so that new ecosystem can ideally bring a lot of people as well.
Yeah. When you look at the change that you guys are getting on, when do you decide to, yes, I've launched there, I'm actually gonna skip it. I'm gonna remove the chain access again because it might not have, the cost benefit trade-off doesn't seem to make sense anymore. Has that ever happened where you will launch on the chain and you're like, hey, well, there's actually not that much traction. I'm gonna remove my capital and deploy it somewhere else because it just makes more sense.
Um, well, you mean remove our capital? Like we don't deploy capital as threshold. You mean like, we like would remove incentives? You mean potentially?
Well, for the LPs that provide the Uniswap liquidity, so to say,
Yeah.
they need to make money somehow, otherwise they'll leave. You guys might put on incentives, or you talk to them and push them a certain way. Like, when do you guys actually put all of those efforts out of a chain? Like, how do you make that decision? And what is the incentive also for the LP providers, right? Like, how do you keep them engaged and actually keep them providing liquidity?
Yep. Yeah. So I think to some extent, like because tBTC is the most trust minimized, in my opinion, Bitcoin asset in DeFi. Like I think we've been able to get a network of LPs and users who are generally like not as mercenary as some of the others. That said, like they're not going to do this out of charity. They're not going to LP out of charity for free. They need to get compensated. They may give tBTC a discount versus alternatives because they trust it more, but they're not going to do it for free. So there does initially need to be that sort of incentive, that initial incentive to bootstrap a new chain. Generally, that comes from, like you said, token incentives, either in T or in the gas asset of that new chain, or from the different ecosystem partners, or some combination, ideally. But obviously, like it's not great for any of those uh, partners providing incentives if they have to provide incentives indefinitely to keep it alive. So that's like we think about incentives as like the early bootstrapping piece, get the thing working, get it listed on lending protocols, CDPs, places where people will park their tBTC long term. And then that would sustain like a sufficient, hopefully, baseline of like organic trading yield for LPs
Mm-hmm.
to keep their capital there.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, what we've seen with some like on Solana, for example, we're gearing up for a big relaunch of tBTC on Solana.
Mm-hmm.
I think for a variety of reasons, our initial tBTC launch on Solana didn't translate into sort of the long-term usage base that we had looked for. So as part of bringing direct minting and direct redemptions to Solana very soon, we're working on a pretty significant reboot for Solana with some of the newer ecosystem projects there that I think will sort of be, I guess, a proof of time for us to prove the sort of new rollout model and see if we can make it work on Solana better than it did the initial launch.
Yeah, I kind of explain liquidity is kind of like a chicken and egg problem, right? Because you don't get volume if there's no liquidity. So liquidity needs to be there first, but if volume doesn't grow, liquidity will be removed again because the incentives are not there. So one of them
Hmm.
has to come first. The liquidity needs to be there first, actually, for volume to come. So more liquidity will probably flow in the more volume there is.
Yep.
Um,
And then I think the other thing that we're doing is we have been working on getting like direct mint and redeem to all the chains that we launch on. So going forward, when we launch on a new chain, it will be with direct mint from Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be a lot easier for people to bring native Bitcoin to that chain than it is right now. In a lot of the places where tBTC is right now, you technically need to first go to Ethereum and you mint to Ethereum L1 and then bridge again. Like that's the way it works for
Okay.
Solana right now. So we're working as part of this reboot on Solana. There will be direct minting from Bitcoin to Solana, so you will basically be able to skip that interim step on ETH, and that will make it a lot easier for Bitcoin to flow directly to these
Yeah.
ecosystems.
One of the issues that I kind of foresee is that if you don't have enough liquidity on the dexes, people cannot borrow as much because you can, if the liquidation price is triggered, there needs to be enough liquidity. How is the amount of liquidity you have on the dex impacting the amount of borrowing and lending that is happening on the protocols?
Yeah, I mean, well, if the lending protocol is doing its diligence correctly, like they're not going to list it at its collateral unless there is sufficient liquidation or sufficient depth for them to be able to liquidate properly
Mm-hmm.
on chain. Um, so I think like again it like varies. Like Aave is going to have different requirements, and usually a lot of the time they're outsourcing this work to like third party risk providers, like
Mm-hmm.
the Llama risks, etc. of the world. And taking a look at what like they have their own sort of benchmarks internally, and that will differ for Aave versus Compound versus Morpho versus the equivalents on non-EVM chains. Um, but yeah, I mean, generally, like I would I would hope that like lending protocols aren't onboarding assets without doing proper diligence and making sure that they actually have ability to liquidate because I think we've seen in many cases in DeFi that's how you end up with potentially very significant amounts of bad debt.
True, true. But it's also, I think, your responsibility in a way to make sure there's enough liquidity so you don't get declined by these borrowing and lending protocols, right?
Yeah,
Because
for sure.
to their extent is their due diligence, but you cannot rely on people missing their due diligence on how much can be liquidated. And also, like on Ethereum, someone can probably borrow 1 million tokens or $1 million with Bitcoin as backing because there's 250K within 2%. But going to
Mhm.
like 10 million or 20 million is going to be tough because there's by far not enough liquidity to at least liquidate within, let's say, a 2 or 3% slippage, which is maybe the max you want to have if something gets triggered, right?
Yep.
So what are the chains that you feel like are upcoming or where you start to see a lot of more activity happening that you're on right now?
I mean, the ones that we're on right now, so obviously, like the largest amount of tBTC liquidity is still on ETH1. And tBTC is essentially on all like the as collateral on all the blue chip DeFi protocols there. We've also seen pretty strong growth on Arbitrum and Base. I think those are the two sort of EVM L2s that have the strongest DeFi ecosystems at the moment with quite a bit of momentum. And those are also coincidentally the two L2s right now that have direct minting with tBTC. So for Arbitrum and for Base, you can take your Bitcoin and go directly to either of those without having to stop over on ETH1. Um, and I obviously like there's like this nice flywheel there of like we saw that strong early growth on Arbitrum and Base, and so we added direct minting, and now it's sort of feeding on itself. That's the kind of thing that we hope to replicate for all the chains that we launch on and all the chains that we add, the current chains that we support that we're going to add direct minting to going forward.
Yeah. When it comes to the marketing side of things, like how do you make sure that you get more attention on like a rep BTC, which is I think a big competitor to yours, or maybe also to the token. I mean, a lot of people use KOLs, but I mean KOLs in my opinion feel like a way to boost hype and
Hmm.
speculation rather than you guys are looking for actual people that start to do the minting stuff because that's where you guys make the money from. How do you guys look at the marketing side of things and what has really worked for you guys to get more attention, actually users on the tBTC?
Yeah, so historically, like Threshold Network, the marketing function has been operated by the DAO, and essentially, like Threshold Network spent nothing on marketing. So, like knock on wood, like all the growth that we've seen in tBTC so far has been either a earned coverage or just organic growth. That said, like I think that's been a neglected function for tBTC historically, and I think we can we're in the process of building out like a more robust marketing org to sort of rectify this and hopefully really pour fuel on the fire for tBTC.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so it's hard. I can't say yet like what has worked versus what hasn't because we haven't done anything yet. But that's about to change very
Well,
soon.
I mean
And
that worked already. Not doing anything was the thing that worked.
well, I mean, I think in my opinion, tBTC should be quite a bit bigger than than it is now, and so we're hoping to fix that going forward. Um, but I, mean, I think what you're going to see is a much stronger focus on cross-chain launches. So when we launch on a new chain, people will be aware of it. And I think sometimes we just sort of drop the ball on making people aware that hey, tBTC is on Base, is on Solana, is on all these different chains. So we're going to be much more aggressive in just bringing awareness to these launches going forward, and that obviously will also help with this initial liquidity buildup and getting it to be a sustainable, useful asset on those chains as it launches. That'd be a combination of like co-marketing with that that destination chain, co-marketing with the relevant ecosystem projects in that chain that want to use tBTC as club. Um, and then I think the other piece is I think just having a lot of educational content and being a lot more clear about the value prop of tBTC versus say WBTC or CBBTC or these more centralized alternatives, so that people understand like what is the benefit or like why would I use tBTC over CBBTC or WBTC or whoever, um, and then because a lot of people probably they WBTC is everywhere. I mean, it was the first mover. It's at least on ETH1. It's in every protocol as collateral. So it's like the easy choice. I think that started to change, both for both because of CBBTC launches, tBTC growth, and the sort of self-inflicted stuff that WBTC did themselves. But it's still quite a large protocol in terms of TVL. And just sort of highlighting tBTC's differentiation and value prop there, and the fact that it's run in a trust minimized way for over 4 years without any loss of user funds, which is I think is quite a long time, particularly given like how large of a honeypot it would be if there was if there did happen to be some sort of vulnerability there. So I think that is a good amount of, I mean, in crypto terms, like 4 years is a long time. It's a very strong Lindy, like the client base, I think is quite robust at this point. So I think just hammering home these unique value props of tBTC is what will be a lot louder about going forward.
Got it. I think that makes sense. I got a couple more questions around like the liquidity on the centralized exchange because you guys are on Binance, you guys are on a lot of centralized exchanges. How are you guys managing that with market makers on retain or a loan option model? And
Mhm.
maybe we'll dive into some issues you guys have had in the past and how you guys have possibly tackled that. Very interesting, especially because you guys are a merge of like two, tokens, which probably
Yep.
had market makers before. But can you walk me through kind of like roughly the setup on a high level?
Yeah, so the DAO runs most of this, and we don't do a ton of like Threshold doesn't do a ton of market making for the T token. I believe the DAO right now does engage with a market maker for T on some centralized exchanges on a pay for like a subscription model essentially. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not a loan option model, at least that I'm aware of currently. Uh, what we did have a call option loan model for new back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that I think that was like a yeah, I mean like pretty standard. Like I think people are probably watching this understand how that works. Is you
Mm-hmm.
loan some of the tokens to a market maker with a strike price that they can exercise to purchase those tokens. After some term, where that's I think it was like 2 years or 2 or 3 years or something like that in our case. But that agreement is new launch in 2020, so that agreement is well done in the past.
Yeah. What was the reason you guys were choosing the retainer model right now rather than a loan option model?
Um, I mean, I think from the threshold DAO's perspective, and like most token holders' perspective, like the T token is a pretty depressed price relative to tBTC's traction and hopefully future growth. And so I think there's not a whole lot of appetite to like lend out significant amounts of tokens with strike prices near the current spot. I think that's driving like a pretty significant amount of it. Is like
Yeah.
the DAO right now we'd rather be a buyer of the T token through bridge fees and just try to suck up as much as we can at this price
Mm-hmm.
than sell at this price.
Yeah, I love that you guys say that. Like what we see, at least in the market, that every project wants to get rid of their token, but no one wants to buy it back. So it's great to hear a project actually want to say like, well, we prefer to buy back at these prices because we think it's a bargain. But
Hmm.
I think that also a big part of that is probably also because you guys are a revenue positive business. You guys actually have a revenue stream, which is the minting process, right? Well, for a
Yeah.
lot of projects, they don't have enough revenue yet, and they're definitely far from profit. So the only way to sustain their runway is by liquidating tokens.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair. And obviously there's like a big difference between like buy having a buyback program that's coming out of revenue that the protocol is generating versus having a buyback program because
A VC
a year
invested.
ago you sold a bunch of tokens at a much higher price.
Yeah.
You just have like a treasury. So I think we're very focused on sort of continually, like really dramatically improving T tokenomics than the tokenomic model through this buyback mechanism and potentially through this fee rebate staking program that I mentioned before, and other things that we're in the process of validating and potentially implementing. Um, and obviously, like ultimately, like the biggest impact on that will be like truly what amount of revenue and profits can the protocol generate through either bridge fee or some other mechanism that would be impactful in terms of buybacks. So right now, I think for Q1, the annualized run rate for tBTC was something like $4 to $5 million dollars based off
Mm-hmm.
of the volume. Um, that's not nothing, but like we want to like basically 10x that and have it
Mm-hmm.
really be like 50, 40, $50 million of profit a year that's going into buying back the T
Yeah.
token, and that would
Wow.
be a very significant amount if we can achieve that.
Yeah. Do you guys like? I assume you guys don't put everything into buybacks, right? Like, what? How do you guys look at the revenue generated versus the buybacks that you guys are doing on the protocol?
Yeah, yeah. So I don't really believe in just like automated. I want the DAO to have some discretion over like the timing.
Yeah.
Like I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense just to like have like regularly scheduled like automated buybacks that happen no matter what. One, those are like just easy to front run if people know when they're coming, and
Yeah.
then two, I mean like there are times when it makes sense to buy and when it makes sense to sell, and I think the role of the DAO is to optimize long-term value for token holders, and that doesn't mean just buying no matter what the price is, and it also doesn't mean selling no matter what the price is, right? Like
Yeah.
there are times when the market's giving you a price that it makes sense to buy as many tokens as you can as the
Mm-hmm.
DAO, sort of where the DAO, where we are right now. There are times where the protocol long-term value for token holders is better served by building up the project's runway and treasury,
Yeah.
so that it can survive some future extended bear market, which I'm sure we'll see again at some point.
Yeah.
Um, so that's roughly how I think about it. I think it's like I think people overcomplicate DAOs. I mean, we've overcomplicated DAOs in the past, but fundamentally, I think the role is just optimize long-term token holder value.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. When who is executing these buybacks? Is it a market maker? Or is it a DAO? Actually sitting in front of the
So
computer
the
and doing those
buyback,
executions.
yeah, there's a treasury guild function within the DAO, which is basically like a multi-sig of community members.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I believe so far they've been executing stuff as limit orders on CalSwap.
Mm-hmm.
So on you can see these, at least we can see the buybacks that have happened so far on chain. But I could also imagine, like engaging a market maker to be able to access like centralized exchange liquidity, for example, in the future.
Got it. Cool. Those are basically all the questions that I had. Any learnings or any big mistakes you guys have made that you think might be useful for anyone who's listening to take away from? I mean, your more than 3 years of experience of running the T token.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The interesting thing with Threshold is I think we actually like sort of tried to decentralize some of it too early. So when I think about Threshold and tBTC, really the only thing that matters to be decentralized is how the Bitcoin is custodied and how the protocol itself operates. It doesn't matter if we have like a decentralized DAO run marketing team, BD team, growth team, etc. Like I think that was a mistake that we tried to do too early. And so what we've been doing recently is actually rolling some of that back and bringing that into under the sort of hood of this new T Labs entity, which is responsible for a lot of these ancillary operations like future product development, marketing, go to market, etc. Um, so maybe that's one thing is like think very hard about like obviously like the value prop for blockchain is decentralization, censorship resistance, etc. Like, but think very hard about what are like the key pieces that actually that matters for. Um, in our case, it's like the custody of the Bitcoin, not really.
But also
Um,
I guess what retail or the users actually care about, right? Because I think the other way is, let's say you have a similar, like RepBTC might not be as decentralized as you guys are, but still has more adoption.
yep.
Maybe some users don't care too much about real decentralization, which I think for a lot of protocols might be the case. And you
Hmm.
guys' USP is really that part. So I think it's twofold. It's what do the users care about? Well, I think it's also important to stay fully decentralized. What do they care about on decentralization side? And marketing might not have to be part of that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. Is I think the value prop for tBTC and for Threshold is going to be, and the type of user that's interested in it is not going to be the same for every protocol. Um, but being very clear on that, I think was that slowed us down in many ways because we
Mm-hmm.
tried to decentralize these functions. We didn't have like the ability to move as fast as some of the alternatives and competitors, which is has changed now going forward. But that was something I think speed is very important. Obviously, like with Threshold, we're dealing with Bitcoin, and we want to be as careful as possible and conservative as possible. But in terms of like the product and making sure that that collateral is as secure as it can possibly be. But it's also important that we can move quickly, that we can be responsive to the market. And I think that's something that we haven't done quite as well historically as we should have been doing, and that we're doing now.
Yeah. What were some things that really worked well for you guys? Is that like, hey, if I were a project, I would take this route again because it worked really well for us in order to get adoption and growth in.
Yeah, I think sort of counterintuitively, like tied to this last point, is like I think there's a balance between moving quickly and then chasing like whatever the latest trend or narrative is. And so like and sometimes like as part of this like us being too decentralized in some operational aspects too early, like we didn't chase these narratives. Like we were always very focused on this North Star of like building the most trust minimized, censorship resistant Bitcoin representation for DeFi as we could. Um, so I think like that's the sort of double-edged sword is like you need to move quickly, but you don't want to just be chasing whatever random narrative is happens to be popular on crypto Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
That I think it's important to have some conviction in what the thing is that you're building, and you need to give it enough time where you've built a really good product that solves that user need, and it
Yeah.
has time to succeed. So it's like sort of you know can benefit you and can hurt you depending on how
Yeah.
confident you are about this trade-off.
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of token products. They launch in a specific chain, let's say Solana, but then, for the speculative side of things, they also go on base because that's where the narrative is at that point, right? And I'm like, well,
Hmm.
if you're a Solana-based project and everyone can use your token within Solana, but not within base, what is then the need to really go on base besides the hype? And that's just chasing speculation, I guess, and that is
Yeah.
not built focusing, because every moment or every minute spent on trying to focus on speculation is not spent on the product itself, and it might distract you too much rather than you keep the focus and know that in 3 years down the line you'll be further ahead, but in a month you might be lacking a little bit compared to following the hype.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think like it's very easy to fall in the trap of like, oh, if we just launched on Base, like all our problems will be solved, or if we just launched on, Solana, all our problems will be solved. But if you don't have product market fit on whatever your current chain is, like, I mean, maybe in some cases, like just the particular user base you're targeting happens to be on this entirely other chain, but for the most part, just because you launch on a new chain isn't going to suddenly summon product market fit out of nowhere. Um,
No, I think you should be able, if you have a really good product, you should probably be able to get, at least on all EVMs, be able to get decent traction relative to the amount of users on the chain.
mhm.
And if people really need you, you're able to sense that from the market as well. They might even move assets over in order to use it. Doesn't mean you need to stay on that chain, but assessing product market fit might be, unrelated to the chain that you're on. And if you want to play it safe, you pick first the chain that has the most amount of traction in general, and you assess product market fit, and then you just stay on that.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. That was really useful. Any other things that really worked for you, or things that really didn't work for you, as well? Some learnings that you had that you think are useful to share.
Oh man, so many. It's sort of hard to just pull anyone out of nowhere. I'd have to give it some more thought, but I think that covered the main one. Is I think having conviction in what you're building, for the long term, not chasing narratives, but at the same time moving quickly, being able to be responsive to user needs and changing market needs.
Yeah. One of the things I often say as a last word is cut down the noise, because there's a lot of investors or retail, pulling on you, screaming to you that you need to go to this chain, you need to get the price up. Price is the most important thing to them. But down the
Mhm.
line, what matters is if you have a useful product, and selectively listen to the users and not the speculators, because the speculators scream the most, but they're the least useful to actually getting user feedback.
Yep. I think that's definitely good advice. I mean, I guess crypto is interesting because in many cases, like users are also the investors. Not always the case, but certainly if some investor is screaming at you to launch on XYZ chain or to do XYZ thing, and they're not actually deploying TVL or using your protocol, like you can probably safely ignore
Exactly. Uh,
essentially everything they're saying.
cool. Thanks a lot. I'll stop the recording now.